I will just introduce myself as a former athlete. I was in the heptathlon in track and field, Canadian champion in the 80s. And then I got my PhD in sports sciences. And then I became a coach. So I've been coaching for about 30 years now. And then in 2014, I was elected as president of my provincial track and field athletics association. So I've had a lot of different roles in leadership. And I do also want to say that I was a beneficiary in the 80s of Title IX because I was on a full scholarship in the United States, University of Maryland. And so I feel like I have a duty to speak in this way because I actually did benefit from legislation that, was there put in place because women had not had the opportunities. And so I guess where did my journey begin in this whole dystopia of trans in sport? I think it was about in January 2018. As president of my association, I had to go to national meetings and they asked me, since I was one of the few women leaders, if I would sit on a gender panel or something, because the government of Canada was trying to push an ideology and a certain set of rules. And so as I was sitting there looking at the policy proposals, it struck me that something was weird going on, that all of a sudden they said, well, people can self-identify into whatever sport category they want. And of course, obviously, with a PhD in human biology and many years in sport, and just like Paula was saying about being tested all the time, I just thought this is just crazy. And so I looked at the men around the table and I said, wait, what are we talking about here? You're saying like a boy could be in a girl's race or a man could be in a woman's race? And they kind of looked down at their hands and they were just kind of like saying, well, what are we going to do? It's going to be the rule. And I looked at them as if like, what in the world? Are you guys crazy? Like, how are you accepting this? This is not right. So then, of course, that was a big shock. I guess the shock was the unwillingness of the male leadership. And let's face it, most of the sports leaders who make policy and the rules are men. So if they're not going to stand up, that was my first lesson right there, because I felt like I was being dismissed and my concerns were being dismissed and they were embarrassed. And I think part of it was their fear that they're not going to get the funding from the government. The second shock when I went home was to look up the IOC. I thought, surely I can appeal to the Olympic policy. So then I look up the IOC policy and I realized in 2015, the IOC instantiated this rule, the consensus, that said that also any male could self-identify into the women's category by living as a woman for a year, declaring whatever that means, and then not having any surgery at all, just somehow putting their testosterone down. And we always know that if they're going to be tested, they can take their testosterone levels down to castration levels in 12 hours if they just need to do it for a test, and it'll bounce back up again. So I knew that was also just going to be no gateway at all. So I guess as I dove into this, the further absurdity, so now I'm going to explain absurdities that I've continued to run into as I decided to speak out on this issue. The first absurdity is that when I looked at where this policy was coming from in Canada, it was coming from the committee. So it's called the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, which was set up after the Ben Johnson, Carl Lewis scandal. So when the Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson was humiliated, I mean, they caught him. He won the gold medal in Seoul Olympics in 1988. And then Canada was ashamed because this was a big doping scandal. And so then by 2003, this whole sort of a little bit of a government bureaucracy was set up to make sure Canadian sports don't cheat. So the main mandate of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, CCES, was to make sure sports in Canada did not cheat. And that was the panel, that was the governing body that was pushing now this new rule to allow men into women's sports. And I look at this and I think, well, there are 9 like when you're doping, it's like a 9 to 10% advantage, maybe. But if you're a man, it's a 10 to 50% advantage. So it's even worse than doping if you allow somebody to do this. I mean, it's not rocket science. That's exactly what it is. It's like 5 times, up to 5 times worse than doping if you look at it that way. And then, so I went to another national meeting very soon after this discovery, and I'm sitting in this meeting room, and they said we have a special presentation on equity and inclusiveness in sports. So they bring this woman in to the room, and all of us track and field officials and coaches and top leaders are sitting in this room. And this woman starts to tell us about the genderbread man and about how there's really no difference between women and men, really only 12%. Like 12%, what are you talking about? And then when they finally like finished introducing her, she was representing the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport. So it's the women's association that was supposed to be protecting women in sport was the one that they were sending out like missionaries to preach this gospel of gender ideology to all the sports groups across Canada. Now we're spread out in Canada over like, four time zones, and we have communities that are kind of all over the place. So they have to send these people, all these different places because we don't really always talk to each other naturally. We always have to have this special sort of extra effort to teach a new rule. Well, to me, that was just insane. And when I asked her, I was the only person in the room, and I asked the question, why, Jennifer, what's the difference? How can you explain the difference in world records between men and women? Like, please explain that. If you're saying there's no big deal, why? And she literally had the chutzpah to tell us that it was just socialization. We haven't given girls a chance to, her own argument is so ridiculous because she's also not giving girls a chance if she lets men to come into the sport. But her argument was there's no biological difference. It's just that girls don't have a chance when they're younger the way boys have had. So, I mean, these people are completely ridiculous. And so then I went back and I called the man who was in charge of CCS privately to say, Paul, are you crazy? Like, what's going on? What is this? And he basically told me that I was exaggerating, that really I was just being mean, and we're doing this to be safe and inclusive and diverse. And I'm like, he's using all these silly words that we hear through like all of this sort of postmodernism. And so basically I said, well, Paul, it can't be safe because if it's in a contact sport, they're going to hurt each other. The men are going to hurt the women. So you're not making it safer. And if there's a man in a woman's race, the woman loses. So then you're not actually making it more inclusive either. So don't tell me it's safer and inclusive. So he just thought I was just exaggerating. Oh, there's not going to be that many anyway. So now I'm really happy after all this time of advocating on Twitter and wherever I can do. Now to see, of course, World Rugby has made this particular ruling that no, in the elite sport, at least in elite rugby worldwide, males will not be able to compete in the women's game. But then Rugby Canada, Rugby Australia, all these, Rugby USA, they've all mentioned they're not going along with World Rugby, that they're just going to go ahead and let trans women play in the women's game. So this is the third absurdity, is that even the world governing body has said it's going to be 20 to 30% more injuries if you allow men in a woman's event in a game. And yet the USA, Canada, and all these other places on the ground are saying, no, we're not going to listen to World Rugby. Well, that's going to be an insurance claim right there, because I'm sorry that it's going to come down to some woman getting her neck broken. But the minute that goes into litigation, are you kidding me? All they have to say is you knew better because your world governing body already told you that was more dangerous. So I don't know where this ends, but the absurdities are beyond bounds. And I guess all I'm going to tell you, I guess what I have to say is please have courage, all the women out there who are listening to this, because there are things that are beginning to happen, and there are things you can do. In my level, like, what have I done about it? Well, first of all, in my association, I established my own rules. I did not take their policy and copy paste. I made our biological rules. So if you're born male, you do not compete in the women's category. You only compete as a man. So in our own association at the provincial level, at the ground level, we can lead from the bottom, and we can actually put in the right policy. And online, obviously, we're making connections like this. Thank you, women, for all tuning in, because having advocacy around the world really helps. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, groups, join the groups. Fair Play for Women, Save Women's Sports. This group, the Women's Human Rights Campaign, and the Declaration. And we've had petitions, and I know Paula Henkel and many others had a petition last year, but we've got a new petition this year. Sooner or later, the IOC will have to start listening. They're not very good at listening, but sooner or later they will listen. And I guess finally, I will say, in my own case, I'm learning how to write. I've written articles now in Post Millennial, in Quillette, and I am now going to publish a book in the next month. I finished the first edition, or the first draft, and I'm writing a book entitled Transcending Sport in Canada and Beyond, the battle for a level playing field. I'm going to publish this book, and my co-author is Barbara Kay. And we are almost finished. So that's going to be out there. Please tell people about it when it comes out. I heard through the back door privately from somebody in World Rugby that when all of this first came out, and then, England, Canada, USA were going against their global World Rugby policy, and we were all just speaking out. In those moments, in those first few days, those countries and those rugby unions felt very uncomfortable because we were speaking out. It was making a big difference in their feelings of, oh no, we might be doing a mistake. But after a few days, everybody goes on to the next issue, and then there's no pressure anymore. So I think one of the things that I'm learning is that social media can be effective, but we have to maintain a certain level of activism and speaking the truth, just like all of us are doing today, to never let them forget and never let people think, oh, we just survived the hurricane of, feedback from women. No, this is not going to end. We will never stop speaking, and they will hear from us over and over again. And so I think it's just really important to keep the heat on everything and on these so-called leaders who are cowards, who aren't doing anything about this policy. It seems like if you're going to start using gender ideology as eligibility rule, that's nothing different than saying we're going to split sport up by Catholic, Protestant, or Democrat or Republican. It's all an ideology. So it doesn't matter. If you were born male, you can wear a dress and go in the male's race. I mean, I don't care what you dress like. The thing is, there's nothing to do with it. If the men are self-identifying as a female, as a woman, then the men should accept them as being a different looking person in the men's sports. It really doesn't have to do with anything. It's an idea in your head. So, and if they want to change their bodies, then it's their responsibility if they've put themselves at a disadvantage. But, in our sports, we compete on the basis of biology. And so this is what the policy my board and I put in was, if you were born male, you compete male, irrespective of how you identify. If you're a female, you compete, you can have the option, because there's no competitive advantage. If you want to compete with the males, that's up to you. But if you want to compete with the women, then we have to make sure you're not taking testosterone. So the minute you start taking testosterone or extra, cross-sex hormones, then obviously, then either you're going to be accused or guilty of doping, or you go with the men, and that's also fair. Because you don't have a competitive advantage. So